Oh, hello. My name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Whoa. Okay, so this is the second video in what I thought would be a much more frequent series on my channel, but it has been literally more than a year since I did my last one, and that is a where to start with video. So I want to, and I need to do some organization and be a little bit better about this, but I want to take authors whose work I've read widely in and give you guys recommendations of places where I think they like some of their best things that they've done or good places to start with them. The previous video I did with this was my first one on Agatha Christie, and I guess I kind of did a follow-up one talking about where to start with Poirot. But today I thought I would do a where to start with C.S. Lewis video, because especially in my teens, I've read almost everything that he's ever written. He was a very formative author for me in a lot of ways, and it's interesting looking back because I think in terms of the kind of philosophical place that he was coming from, I'm no longer as sympathetic to some of his arguments. They're not as compelling to me, or whatever. It's a little different for me now looking back, but I still have a lot of respect for him as a thinker and as an incredibly effective writer. Like, C.S. Lewis's sentences are simple and just like perfect. Like, he's one of those writers who knows how to communicate complicated things in an incredibly clear way, which I think has been very influential on my own writing style. Like, and that's usually the feedback that I get from people when they read things that I've written, is especially like essays or things of just like, oh, like you can say that really clear. And I honestly think that that's because I read so much C.S. Lewis like when I was learning how to write, basically. I just really admire him as a technician. So from that respect, I have like a huge amount of admiration from him. I still really enjoy a lot of his fiction because I really like his overall project, which is to infuse philosophy into fiction. So even if I don't always I may not always be as sympathetic these days to the philosophy he's infusing, but I still think he does it in an interesting way that is like worthy of consideration and that has like stood up pretty well over the last 70, 80 years. So anyway, I thought I would give you kind of three categories. One being his philosophical fiction, one being his more just like philosophy or religious writings, like the ones that I think are kind of better, and the other one just being sort of like nonfiction writ large from him. So let's actually start with just sort of his general nonfiction. So C.S. Lewis's day job was essentially as a professor of literature in Oxford and then later Cambridge. And he was a really well-respected, noted scholar in that area, right? Like he was a very well-known academic. And I definitely would, if you like literary criticism, I really like the way he does literary criticism. I've read most of it at this point, I think. And the one that I like the best is An Experiment in Criticism. It definitely gets into some of his sort of general philosophy and kind of how he thinks about communication and whatever, but like it's a really well done book that's very interesting and I find really thought-provoking. And I would definitely recommend it if you're somebody who likes kind of reading nonfiction literary criticism type books. I think that An Experiment in Criticism is sort of a classic, and for good reason. The other kind of general nonfiction book I would point out is A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis. This is basically a memoir. It's sort of like a very personal response to the death of his beloved wife. And, we don't have, we're getting more of them these days, I feel like, but there's not a whole lot of, classics about grief and loss that are well done and, have stood up well. And I definitely think this is one of them. It's a very short little book. It's an incredibly personal and incredibly painful book that I don't think he really saw being published. But I just think that it's really beautiful, and I've kind of been rereading it a little bit recently with the loss of my father, and I just think that there's just these little moments that I think really resonate. Even when I just first opened up this book recently and it said, "No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. I'm not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid." It was just like, oh yeah, I get what you're going at with this. So it's just honestly a lot of kind of just thoughts about grief, and it definitely does have a religious bent to it if that bothers you, but it's so personal that I think you can probably deal with it because there's just a lot of very personal musings. Anyway, all that to say, I just think this is really, really good. And actually, let me add one more in here to sort of general nonfiction. So this is one that sort of, I think, is between his more explicitly religious fiction versus his philosophical nonfiction that could have general applicability, that's The Four Loves. That book has actually been really something that I still cite a lot to people when I'm giving advice or when I'm thinking about things. It's a really good book. It kind of talks about the different types of love that we have. He talks about like erotic love, familial love, love of like friendship love, especially his stuff about like love between friends and sort of just like general goodwill, like, and especially what's experienced like between people that you just know really well. Both of those things have a lot of little nuggets in them that I have oft cited over the years. I think that that's also a really good one. I also have a recording of him reading it, and I really enjoy that. If you can get your hands on it, it's definitely worth your while. I think that that's also one that I would recommend as sort of general nonfiction, verging into our next category, which is more specifically religious nonfiction, and where he's either doing apologetics or kind of dissecting a theological argument or idea. There's Mere Christianity is sort of a classic in apologetic literature. I mostly still like it. I think it has some real blind spots in it. That's neither here nor there. I really think The Weight of Glory is a very underrated little sort of essay, like extended essay. If I was gonna pick one that is just like my favorite of his in that vein, it's Letters to Malcolm, which is chiefly on prayer. It's told in epistolary form, which is something he does really well. We'll get to that later. And basically this is just thoughts about like, what is prayer? Why does it work? How does it work? And I think that even if you are not specifically Christian, there's a lot in this that could apply to meditation, I think, as well. So in that sense, I think this is a better pick because I think it could be extrapolated out a little bit more. And it's actually the last thing he wrote, and I think it's him at his most mature, like his thought processes are at their most mature. Yeah, I just think that this is kind of an underrated one for him, but this is one that I personally like. It's my favorite of this type of book that he does, and I think it's the one that holds up best for both believing and non-believing audiences. Like, I think if you're open to the idea of meditation or like prayer of any kind, you could probably get something out of this. So that's why I thought it was a good place to recommend starting. So finally, I wanted to recommend 3 of his pieces of fiction that I think essentially all C.S. Lewis fiction is deeply infused with philosophy. Like, he is very interested in allegory. He's very interested in sort of like taking theoretical ideas and enacting them in fiction, right? So like, if you're not on board with that project, Narnia you may still be able to get down with, but the rest of it is not so much going to be your jam. But I've seen enough people who are not sympathetic to his philosophy still enjoy some of these things that I think it's worth putting out there as something you might like trying. So my favorite piece of fiction from him, probably, I don't know, I go back and forth with this in Narnia, is The Great Divorce. I think that he just has a lot. It's essentially the idea that there's people who are in purgatory and they take like a day bus trip to the outskirts of heaven, and they have all of these one-on-one interactions with various people in their lives. And I think that there's some observations in there that are really powerful, and that even to this day, even as I drift further away from being as sympathetic with his philosophy, I still think that there's some incredibly powerful observations about human nature and about how people interact and how we can let small things in our lives really grow into bigger things. My biggest takeaway from that book is basically who you are on a day-to-day basis determines who you ultimately are. So like, you need to live each day purposefully because small things turn into lifetime things. I personally really love that book, and I think that people could probably enjoy it even if they don't love or even if they don't agree with the underlying philosophy. I think there's a lot in there still that's observationally very interesting, and one that really stuck with me. And then the Screwtape Letters. These like get put on, this is sort of like one of the great epistolary novels, and I think, again, even if you don't love where he's coming from philosophically, I think there's a lot of just really interesting observations about human nature. It's very humorous in a lot of places. This is an illustrated edition, so there's some fun drawings in here, but I think that this is a really engaging and fascinating kind of peek into his mind, and I think it also really shows off his humor and his ability to just, like his wittiness, I guess, or like his ability to just write with a lot of sort of panache and be very charming in his writing. This is one that a lot of people really love, and for good reason. It's just a really great book. And then finally, we come to Narnia. So Narnia is in theory where you should start with C.S. Lewis, and I think it's where a lot of people do start with C.S. Lewis. And for good reason, because it is like a definitive children's classic. It's one that I will happily read to any children that I have. It's on my nieces, the day that they were born, I gave each of them this beautiful illustrated single volume edition. That was my day of birth gift to each of them, because I just think that it's a wonderful portal fantasy. It's just a classic. It's something that I would love every child to read. It does have a lot of, I think, really sweet lessons in it, and even as an adult, when I reread sometimes, it will make me cry, because I'm just like, oh, this is just such a good reminder to me about friendship or whatever. It's just so good. So we come to the question of which Narnia book should you start with, because there are two distinct schools of thought. One being they should be read in the order of their original publication, in which case you would start with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and one of which being that you should start chronologically within the world, even if that's not the order of publication, and that would be The Magician's Nephew. C.S. Lewis himself wrote a letter to someone asking him about this, basically being like, you do you, boo. He didn't really feel that strongly about it ultimately. Do with that what you will. My favorite book in the entire series is The Magician's Nephew, and I personally am somebody who would probably prefer to read it chronologically, so that is my suggestion, is that you start with The Magician's Nephew. That being said, I think The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is more of a classic. Of the 7 Narnia books, it's the one that is the best known, so there's definitely an argument to be made that just go ahead and start with that one. But personally, this is my favorite C.S. Lewis book, so I'm going to recommend that you would start with this one. This is essentially a creation type narrative for a different world, for the world of Narnia, and it does the portal piece really well. I really love all the stuff with Uncle Andrew. There's this beautiful scene where Aslan is singing the world into creation, and that's really striking. I mean, I just think that this is one of the best books I've ever read. I love this book. So yeah, so I'm gonna say you should start with this one, but just know that it is a hotly contested issue, and I'm sure people will tell me in the comments why I'm wrong. So there you go. But there you go. So again, I think that C.S. Lewis is somebody who's I've read, I'm gonna say probably 95% of everything they ever wrote, and he wrote a lot. He was unquestionably my favorite author from probably ages 13 to 23 or 4. There was a period in my life where I absolutely adored C.S. Lewis. I was reading him constantly. I've read a lot of him. So these are my suggestions, kind of taking the lens of maybe recommendations for people who are not necessarily as bought into his underlying worldview, which is very specifically Christian. So I was trying to find a balance between honoring what is very clearly his intent versus where I think people could still get things out of him even if they are not wholly sympathetic to that point of view, if that makes sense. That was sort of the line I was trying to walk. Not sure how successfully I did that, but that's my humble suggestions of some places where you can start with C.S. Lewis. Anyway, that was a where to start with video. Hopefully I will get my act together and do this a little bit more, because it's fun for me to kind of think about, and I think it's just helpful. Somebody is Googling where should I start with this person, I'm happy to throw my 2 cents in there. So anyway, all that being said, I think that will do it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below. And that will do it. Hope you're having a great day, and I will just talk to you soon. Bye!